Another edition of Outside Shots presented by TheLines.com, breaking down all of our Sweet 16 betting action here on the Lines Podcast Network. You can follow us at The Lines US. You can follow me at Eli Herskovich. You can follow my co-host today at Haslametrics. He is Eric Haslam, just because Derek Wagner's internet decided to crap out on him before the podcast started. It's just you and I, Eric, so hopefully we can take this one home.
We got it. Hey, we're prepared. We've watched all these games. We know what's going on, and we're ready for some basketball. Let's talk some Sweet 16.
If we were playing or talking like Wisconsin was against James Madison on Friday, I don't think we would fare super well. Their highest turnover rate in 5 years. I still can't get that out of my head, but we'll touch on your Badgers later. I'm sure that's
absolutely
pretty much.
We will. Yes.
I'm sure that's ingrained in your memory at this point. But if you want to tail or fade our college basketball picks, you can do so with BetMGM promo code The Lines, one word. You bet $5, you get $150 in bonus bets back. And also, if you're in North Carolina listening to us or watching us on the Lines YouTube channel, listening to us, of course, on Apple, Spotify, wherever you find your favorite podcast, be sure to check out thelines.com for all the best Tar Heel State, Blue Devil State, Wolfpack State, whatever you want to call it, with those three teams still alive in the NCAA tournament. Tiger State, I'll allow it, even though they're in South Carolina. Be sure to check out the best North Carolina sports betting promos over at thelines.com. And you can find all of our best bets, including Derek's, in the Lines Discord channel. The link is over at thelines.com in the top right-hand corner. So, Eric, I'll start this off with just the two of us, obviously. The second weekend, so Sweet 16 and Elite 8, featuring 5 AP first-team All-Americans since 2006. First time in about 18 years. RJ Davis, Jamal Shedd, Tristan Newton, Dalton Connect, and Zach Edey, the least favorite player in college basketball, everybody's least favorite player, still playing in March Madness. First time since Randy Foye, Adam Morrison, JJ Redick, Shedden Williams, and Brandon Roy. When I tell you that, what comes to mind?
Well, for me, it just exposes what a chalky tournament it's been so far. I mean, and you can see these matchups that are coming up here with the Sweet 16 and what we're going to get. It's going to be, I won't say dream matchups, but just some really intriguing chalk matchups. Like every year, you usually get a 13 that comes through, and you have a 10 seed that comes through play, and you get a lesser game even in the Sweet 16. It feels like we don't really have that this time around. If you look at the teams that are in the Sweet 16 right now, I'm with the exception of NC State, the other 15 are all in my top 25. San Diego State was just outside of my top 25. They were at 37, but they had a big win over Yale that took them back into my top 25. So when you look at these matchups that we're getting UConn and San Diego State, North Carolina, Alabama, Iowa State versus Illinois, which is going to be defense versus offense. You look ahead at Purdue and Gonzaga, two of the best performing teams in the country right now. Houston and Duke is going to be intriguing. And then, of course, I think the best matchup overall that I'm looking forward to the most is going to be Tennessee and Creighton. You look at this and we see these kind of matchups early on in the year. You see them in November, but teams are kind of figuring out who they are. I think when these matchups happen and they're really deeply ingrained in the personality of who these teams are and they're playing their best basketball, it makes these games far more intriguing, these big games like this that happen in March, as opposed to the ones that happen in November. So I'm really looking forward to this round coming up.
And just to spell out what Eric was mentioning there with all the chalk we've seen, or at least over in the round of 32, favorites going 15-1. In the second round, favorites overall 36-12 in the NCAA tournament. If you've bet a flat $100, let's say, on every underdog money line through 48 games in the NCAA tournament, you'd be down about $800, depending on the closing number at a given sportsbook. But if you bet a flat $100 on every favorite, you'd still be down money. You'd still be down money, about $70. So that tells you, the VIG with some of these favorites, massive favorites. And then underdogs, double-digit dogs are cashing to an extent, but we've still seen the majority of double-digit favorites come through. But Eric, you hinted at all the great matchups or broken them down to an extent. So let's really dive deep into all the Sweet 16 games, our betting angles, our picks to move on to the Elite Eight. Starting off with the East region, a rematch of last year's national championship game in Boston. A little bit of a travel advantage here for UConn, which I'll touch on in a bit. But the number one seeded Huskies overall in the tournament, about a 10.5, 11-point favorite, dominating Stetson and Northwestern despite a near backdoor cover from the Wildcats. I saw you tweeting out on Sunday night saying, UConn probably knew the point spread, and I'm probably with you there because it seemed like they were really trying to cover that thing. And then San Diego State held off UAB, didn't cover in the first round, but dominating Yale and then some in the round of 32 and covering both the first half and second half line, I think. Total in this game is 135.5. My raw numbers have this around UConn minus 9.5, minus 10. So pretty damn close to the actual point spread as of this recording on Monday night here. What does Haslametrics, your site, say about this one? And what do you have to break down with it?
Yeah, so I'm looking at UConn roughly by just slightly under 10 is what I currently have. The over-under on this one, I look at it about 137.5 is what I'm seeing. I'm looking forward. I mean, Connecticut is still going to be that dominant team. The thing about, I have a lot, as we've talked about before, I have 4 futures that are not from the number 1 lines. Well, I take that back. One of them is North Carolina. But watching how these 1 seeds are playing, especially the ones that were the givens, the ones that were going to be the ones for many, many months, which is UConn, Purdue, and Houston, just really impressive the way they've been performing. And I think UConn is going to cruise in this one. I think there's going to be a little bit of a regression now from San Diego State. As I talked, I think that was easily their best performance of the year against Yale. You're coming against a UConn team that just kind of, I don't say they fell asleep a little bit, but just a little bit of a, they let Northwestern, they weren't all the way back in the game, but the lead was getting close down to like 15. But the thing about UConn is when UConn wants to turn it on, they can turn it on. San Diego State, they're the second lowest team remaining in the field for me. They're at number 25. They're the lowest ranked offensive efficiency team for me right now, 52nd in the country, solid defensively at number 13. But Connecticut is top 10 in both. Second in the nation in offensive efficiency, 6th in the defensive efficiency. Connecticut has better numbers away from home. Connecticut has more momentum going back from 4 to 8 games. Everything here, I have no reason to doubt Connecticut getting through this next round. I still think that's a team that's probably going to be right. They're my Final Four pick. I've had them since the start. I have no doubt that they're supposed to get there. I did have this game. At one point, I did pencil in Yale. You can actually see it here. I actually did pencil in Yale to beat Auburn, and then I changed it. That's what you get for changing your mind. But I did have San Diego State getting through this round, but I think this is where it ends for the Aztecs. The Aztecs have played really quite well. They've represented the Mountain West, but I still think there's just too much here for UConn. I got to go with the Huskies in this one.
And what would you say in regards to the spread, just because it's so close to your line, your projected point spread?
Because, and what I would say is I would typically in this situation look at the recent performances, and I don't like when you see a team that really overperforms in the last game. I like to see that regression a little bit in the next one. So in this situation, I've been leaning UConn this entire tournament. I'm going to continue to lean UConn to actually cover the spread, not only win.
Yeah, and that's pretty much a market indicator. You're looking for regression points. You're looking for where the number may be a little bit short. Granted, Eric and our projections are pretty damn close to the point spread, but maybe this line, if San Diego State is a little bit tighter with Yale, even if they do win by double figures and don't outperform their expectation, to Eric's point, this line could be around 12, where maybe you say, is this line a little bit too high? But since you made the case for UConn, I just kind of want to throw a couple points where San Diego State could theoretically, on paper, keep it tighter than expected. With UConn in drop coverage, Donovan Clingan, which is a staple of the Huskies defense, San Diego State's mid-range game is actually performing a lot better overall, not just in a small sample size than it did last year, going back to when San Diego State pretty much got boat raced in the national championship. Trammell ranks in the 92nd percentile when it comes to mid-range efficiency, 55th percentile last season. Micah Parrish, 90th percentile in mid-range efficiency, 59th last season. Jaden Ledee, 82nd percentile, and he could theoretically pull Clingan away from the rim. I still can't believe his points prop in the championship game, by the way, was at 7.5 or 8.5. Somehow went under, was trying to bully Clingan down low in the title game. I have no idea what he was doing because his mid-range game could have easily gotten the best of Clingan there. Lamont Butler still ranking in about the 50th percentile range. And then Reese Dixon Waters, the USC transfer, 77th percentile. And then one other thing, You mentioned the Northwestern route, or UConn blowing out Northwestern for the most part. Matthew Nicholson not playing in that game for the Wildcats, so UConn had an advantage down low. Klingon, 14 points, 13 boards, 8 blocks against the Wildcats. But kind of to the point that you brought up, UConn's physicality is just a completely different animal than what San Diego State has seen so far in the tournament and what they saw in the Mountain West. And then Stephon Castle, just a complete X factor defensively. He shut down Boo Buie, whether he's guarding Lamont Butler or whomever for San Diego State. I would expect the same thing. And then what I kind of hit on from the get-go in this, San Diego State playing in Spokane, now having to make the trip to the East Coast, and UConn pretty much having home court advantage in Boston. Pretty big edge for UConn there, where you could maybe bake a little bit more into the number than maybe you initially would for kind of a home court advantage in an NCAA tournament game. And then one last thing for UConn offensively, with those elevator screens and everything else they do to free up Caravan and Spencer from behind the arc, like we saw in the title game. Dutcher's defenses and San Diego State in general really struggles to defend motion. So big advantage for UConn offensively. I don't know if they cover, kind of like this is a 1-point edge in my direction for San Diego State. By no means a big enough edge to bet the Aztecs, but still not a big enough edge for me to bet or advocate betting UConn. But still, a lot of big advantages going in the Huskies' direction unless San Diego State just goes off in the mid-range.
Yeah, Connecticut's coming in with that. I mean, just pick your poison defensively against UConn right there. Like I said, sixth in the country in defensive efficiency, 5th in overall adjusted field goal percentage, 10th defending the 3-point shot, 2nd in the country in near proximity defensive field goal percentage. Just, I mean, the one thing you got to do if you're San Diego State, you got to look at the advantages of where you can get them. They can get to the foul line. They got to create some pressure. They are 41st in the country in potential points off of steals. That's going to be an opportunity where they can get some points off of UConn. But other than that, I mean, UConn's defense is I mean, and we're not even talking about the offense, which is ranks higher than defensively. But when you look at those numbers, it's really going to be tough for a San Diego State team who's ranked 52nd in the country in offensive efficiency to really budge against that UConn defense.
Going back, just kind of, you got my mind thinking a little bit with San Diego State potentially applying a little bit more ball pressure than maybe even they did last year. We saw UConn have a little bit of trouble with St. John's ball pressure. I'm not saying Dutcher's defenses press nearly as much as Patino just historically, but you go back to the title game last year, San Diego State shot 23 threes. And if you remember, and I remember and remembering correctly, they kind of went at Sonogo early on with Mensa, and it did not work. And that really let UConn take advantage in transition, especially in the latter part of the final 10 minutes of that first half when UConn really started to blow the doors off San Diego State. I know the Aztecs made a bit of a run in the second half. Still, though, if the Aztecs want to win this game, I know I mentioned mid-range efficiency, but I think they're going to have to play the high variance role of a dog, which is shoot a lot of threes.
Yeah, I still think it's going to come from the turnover end. I look at this in the team right now. You got 4 guys who average over a steal per game. Anywhere for you got Trammell, Parrish, Butler, and Ledee all qualify for that route. Are going that route. I just don't see it here for San Diego State. I just think that this is just going to be that fallback that we talked about. I still think that Connecticut is arguably the most dominant team in this country. You're getting them a little, obviously both teams get that rest, but all of a sudden San Diego State has that great performance. You're off a few games. I look at them to regress here. I still think the UConn rolls.
On to the second leg of the East region, looking at a great matchup. Defense versus offense, offense versus defense, no matter how you want to look at it. The number 2 seeded Iowa State Cyclones, about a 1.5, 2-point favorite. The 1.5 that you may be seeing at a variety of books or maybe a couple books is juiced towards -120. The Cyclones coming back against Wazoo in the second half and dominating South Dakota State. Kind of a little bit of an outlier performance for me, or at least over the first couple games, just because Iowa State outperformed expectations offensively over the first couple matchups. I want to get your take on that here, since you mentioned that with San Diego State doing the same thing in a smaller sample, just one game against Yale. Illinois coming off dominating performances against Morehead State and Duquesne, but let's keep in mind, it is Morehead State and Duquesne. Total of about 146. My raw numbers have this closer to Illinois by or actually Iowa State by about a half a point. So a little bit shorter than the number. And also remember, this line opened at Iowa State -2.5, -2, -2.5. So action has already come in on the Illini, where maybe if you look at my raw numbers or Eric's raw numbers, you say Iowa State by a half a point. Not a super big edge as much as it was when the openers popped on this game, with Illinois being maybe a little bit more of an appealing dog. But Eric, I'll start with you. What say you here in the second leg of the East region?
Well, I have Iowa State by about 2 in this game. The over-under on this one's about 149 for me. This is a situation here where now I start thinking that these offensive teams kind of have tested the waters and they get past that opening round where I always think those defensive teams, those smaller defensive teams, create a lot of problems for the Kentuckys or the Alabamas. Same classification as Illinois here. Illinois is first in the country in offensive efficiency, 76th in defensive efficiency, the worst of the Sweet 16. But at this point, you've seen this, I think of a year ago. Look at Miami. Miami was 10th in the country in offensive efficiency on Selection Sunday, and they were 133rd in defensive efficiency. So you can win games with offense, and this is a very elite offense with Illinois and what they can do here. So it does not surprise me one bit. This might be a situation where I'd probably lean against the analytics a little bit, and I kind of see the bettors doing the same thing. There's nothing wrong with that. That's one of the things I tell people and say, just look at my analytics. Don't go blindly by them. Use your own opinion in what you see. Use your eyes a little bit. The analytics provide you a little bit of evidence, like evidence at a crime scene, but it's not an open and shut case. In this situation, both of these teams come into this game very hot. I think there's 5 straight positive performances for Iowa State, and for Illinois, I believe it's 4. The interesting thing about it, and one of the numbers, again, a little bit of a misleading metric that Iowa State is, they're 336th in my away from home metric. And they're like, oh my God, so they're going to play away from home. They're going to struggle here. Well, that is not necessarily the case. That just really points to how great they were at Hilton. As a, backing up my point, and I talk about these last 5 games where they've performed above the norm. All 5 games were on neutral courts. So there's nothing to say this can't continue for Iowa State. But that being said, you're talking about another hot team in Illinois, and this is an Illinois team that I think just it's like I said, it's great. You're talking about the number 1 offense against the number 2 defense. Once you get to this stage, I tend to lean more offensively. I think those teams are going to be battle tested in the first 2 rounds. Those Kentuckys, those Alabamas, and those Illinois. And how can I put this the best way? It's kind of like when you buy a new car. If something would have broken, it would have broken by now. That's the way I kind of look at it for Illinois. So I like Illinois advancing here. I like Illinois covering. It's interesting to see where it's going to go. If it's going to hover, what'd you say, a half a point or something like that? You're talking money line here. You're not going to gain a lot off of Illinois, but still, I think that Illinois, I'd probably go against my own analytics in this situation and say that they will cover. I'm just not a guy who goes all in on defense. This is a Iowa State team, 34th in the country in offensive efficiency. Not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it is second worst in the Sweet 16 behind San Diego State. I tend to lean Illinois here.
I'm with you. And you mentioned offense, defense, your ratings. To me, it's going to boil down to pace, and that kind of correlates to if Iowa State can slow this thing down, even though they do selectively run and push the floor, and Illinois obviously wants to push the tempo. Iowa State ranks number 302 when it comes to frequency of possessions in transition defensively. So how often are they having to stop the opponent when the opponent is trying to push the pace? I don't think Iowa State has faced, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, and maybe you would flat out agree with me, I don't think Iowa State has faced a transition attack like Illinois all season long. And then I don't want to necessarily overreact to what I've seen from Illinois over the first couple of games just because it was Morehead State and Duquesne. But Shannon is a monster in transition. If anybody was going to stop him over the first couple of games, it was going to be Morehead State. And they chalked up a lot of threes, and it didn't work, just trying to slow down the tempo and play to that high variance format that I mentioned as to part of the reasoning why I liked Morehead State in that first round game when it came to covering the point spread. Dane Danger, too, off the bench, especially when it comes to offensive rebounding. And this is a Cyclones team that ranks bottom 85 in defensive rebounding percentage. In a tight game, too, Iowa State, number 274 in free throw percentage. Momcilovic, Trey King, Curtis Jones, those guys are reliable. But other than that, like your primary ball handler who could considerably get fouled a decent amount down the stretch, Lipsy shoots it around 70% from the line. So I lean Illinois too. I'm not going with an Iowa State team that has outperformed expectation offensively and probably shouldn't have covered against South Dakota State in the first round.
Yeah, you look at this, and you talked about that. The adjusted free throw percentage I have for Iowa State, 293rd in the country. Free throw percentage for Illinois is 88th. You look at the free throw attempt rate for the Illini, top 5 in the country. They're able to get to the line. They're able to convert the line. That makes a big difference in these games. We've seen that the other day with, I forget what team it was that shot 11 of 24 at one point. It was just
Grand Canyon.
Grand Canyon, awful. And just that you see that occasionally where all these teams are in these games, but they shoot so poorly from the line, it eventually catches up with you. And I think it may catch up with Iowa State here in a very close matchup with the Illini.
And Texas A&M for that matter. And we'll talk about the Aggies, but both teams definitely shot themselves in the foot when it came to free throw shooting. One last thing I want to wrap up here with the East region, just because I don't think we're going to be doing a podcast, or at least the two of us, before the Elite Eight. Assuming it is UConn versus Illinois or Iowa State, which team do you think poses the biggest threat to UConn?
Oh, boy. I still got to say, God, I have been doubting Iowa State all year, and I got to continue to doubt them. So I'm going to go with Illinois. I still think Illinois gets through. I think they've, like I said, I think they weathered that storm that was going to be there. From a standpoint of a team that had that fingerprint of not a great defense with an elite offense, and also a team that arguably ran themselves out in the Big Ten tournament. Like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to play out that way. San Diego State, as I talked about, did the same thing last year where they won 3 straight in the Mountain West tournament, then won 5 games en route to getting to the championship game and losing. No reason that Illinois cannot keep this streak going. Both teams, one of these streaks is going to end when it comes to Illinois and Iowa State. I still think Illinois gets through, and I think they provide the biggest test for UConn. Just the ceiling is just so much higher there, in my opinion, than it is for Iowa State.
I'm with you. And then you have just individual matchup-wise. Coleman Hawkins can drag Klingon away from the rim, and Illinois or Iowa State, not only Illinois State, but Iowa State can't really accomplish that with their 5-out. Not really much of an offense. And then Castle against Shannon would be the one deterrent, but we're not saying that Illinois is going to necessarily upset UConn if they match up, but we both do agree that Illinois would provide the biggest test. On to the West region. Starting off with the first matchup on Thursday, second-seeded Arizona, about a 7-point favorite. They covered against Dayton, probably pretty lucky to do so. Against 6-seeded Clemson. I have Final Four futures on the Tigers going back to mid-February. Total in this game is right around 152.5. Eric, I'm going to go break down this one first, just because you know I am a Clemson Tigers stan. And as we talked about last week, I do not just side with my futures bets, but my raw numbers make this around Arizona -5, which I want to hear your numbers. I intentionally didn't look at them just to kind of hear them firsthand on the podcast. But you look at Arizona and how they upended the Dayton Flyers in the first round, winning by 10 after closing 8.5. Now this line is a 1.5-point differential from that, at least on Monday night. I think Clemson's a 1.5 better. And again, my numbers make this Arizona -5. And then you go back to Dayton, top 5 3-point shooting teams in college basketball efficiency-wise. They shot 29.2% against Arizona on Saturday afternoon. And Deron Holmes missing 2 huge front-end 1-and-1s, which easily could have flipped the game, at least within regards to the point spread. And Arizona, keep in mind, shot 52.8% from the field. So I know Arizona's offense is elite, but when you think about theoretical regression, maybe Caleb Love, cough, cough, I think that could happen for the Wildcats here. And then going back to Clemson, lone underdog to cover and win outright, but officially win outright, the only dog to do so in the round of 32. And they hung on against Baylor. When you go back to the latter part of that game, Jacoby Walter missing 2 big free throws down the stretch to give Clemson a chance to pretty much ice the game. And so I'm not saying Clemson didn't receive any positive variance themselves, but keep in mind they were up 16 with 5 minutes to go. One other thing I really like about Clemson's path so far, PJ Hall averaging just 12.5 points per game in the NCAA tournament. Clemson has gotten to this point without PJ Hall having a huge game. So you think about just intuition-wise, that's a huge bonus for Clemson, assuming Hall doesn't get in foul trouble like he did against Baylor and kind of like he did against New Mexico, even though Clemson pretty much had that game in hand. And Hall also has a matchup advantage, assuming Ballo guards him, because Hall can drag Ballo out from the inside of the arc. And we saw Ballo wasn't really comfortable when Holmes faced up against him, unless Holmes was going back to the basket, which is when Dayton's offense was really at its worst, at least in my opinion. Looking at Clemson defensively, Brownells has done a great job with his defensive scheme, mitigating the man-to-man defense and kind of going more softer man and more zone, which mitigates what we see with the defensive weaknesses, Joe Girard especially, and then Chase Hunter, who has played better at that end of the floor, but still not your best defensive guard. Arizona, they allow and rank number 334 in mid-range attempt rate allowed, and they rank number 203 in three-point attempt rate allowed on your site. Clemson thrives in the mid-range with Hall, Hunter, Girard, and Shefflin to an extent, and if they can get those 2-point looks in the mid-range, get those 3-point looks, they play 5 out, you control the pace, they're elite on the defensive glass. If Jack Clark is able to slow down Pele Larson at the other end, I don't just think Clemson covers, man. I think Clemson wins the game outright.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I think that Clemson is, when you look at I hate to say they're a poor man's Arizona because they're completely different styles, but if you look at the offense and defensive ends, Arizona 12th, Clemson 24th, Arizona 5th, Clemson 41st. Not particularly great defensively, but if you look at it, it's a pretty balanced team in Clemson. The one concern that I've always had about Arizona is that Arizona, just you're waiting for it to happen. They're not the most consistent team in the world. And you see it where they just happen to fall asleep at times, where head-scratchingly so, where they lose to at USC by 13. They lose to Oregon in the Pac-12 final by 8 in that game. As you stated, Clemson has really kind of not played their best basketball, and I think they can play better. And I don't think we've seen Arizona play their worst basketball yet. So looking at my numbers right now, I currently have, and this is based on the average performance throughout the season, I currently have Arizona favored in this game by about 6 with an over-under of about 150.5. That being said, I'm looking at this again, and I'm thinking of these teams ups and downs and how you can trust them. Now, I've never trusted Arizona for a long time. I still think they're snake bitten, and they've gotten through the first 2 rounds. But in my opinion, I think something's due to happen here. I think Clemson has not played its best basketball yet. You can see them really come out and build another big lead on Arizona. And then you were talking about what happens if Arizona falls behind. Yes, they can play their pace. They're 21st in the country in game pace. But all of a sudden, Clemson, 257th, if they can somehow build a lead and slow down this game, that will be frustrating for Arizona, making them play defense. It's going to wear them out at the offensive end. I'm going to strongly contemplate picking Clemson to spread or to cover the spread here, if not outright go on the money line for Clemson.
And if Clemson controls the pace, who knows what Caleb Love we get in this game. Right.
He's been, there was one of my problems. I've always kind of had the same problem with a Terrence Shannon. I have had the same problem with Kihei Clark last year, with Caleb Love. It's always one of those guys that I for whatever reason, you're waiting for something bad to happen. And when things go against them, it seems like Caleb Love tries to put everything on his shoulders, a little bit like Wade Taylor did for Texas A&M. Sometimes that really backfires. You can't have that happen. You got to be a team player. And I'm not so sure we've seen Caleb Love in that situation yet in this tournament. If that happens and Clemson builds that lead and all of a sudden he tries to take on too much himself, that could be problematic for the Wildcats.
So far, we're aligned on UConn at least advancing, aligned on Illinois advancing, and maybe, just maybe, at least aligned on Clemson to cover the point spread and keep it closer. I mean, we touched on this off air. Oregon, definitely one of the unluckier teams when it came to covering the number and then also winning straight up. Probably should have beaten Creighton, but Dayton should have covered the point spread when you go back to that game. I know Holmes' 2 free throw front end misses were their only free throw misses, but you don't shoot 29% on an average day if you're Dayton, considering they're top 5 in 3-point efficiency on the season. So I'm with you. I loved your take on, we haven't seen Arizona play out their worst. We haven't seen Caleb Love play at his worst. Yeah, and they are individually and collectively 2 of the more inconsistent commodities in college basketball. On to the second West Region matchup. Number 1 seeded UNC, about a 4.5 point favorite. This line jolting up from UNC minus 3.5 after dominating Michigan State on Saturday night. They're taking on number 4 seeded Alabama. Tide covering against Grand Canyon, probably a little bit lucky to do so. The Lopes, another unlucky team when it came to covering the point spread when you look at their 3-point numbers and free throw efficiency at that. Total of 173.5. My raw numbers have this closer to UNC minus 3. What about you, Eric?
Well, I have the same thing. I have North Carolina by 3. It's interesting that over-under is as high. I only have that at, I want to say, what's at 166? So they are really anticipating a shootout in this game, which kind of surprises me a little bit. I've kind of seen the the over-unders coming in a little bit lower than expected. At least that was kind of brought to my attention. So this is going to be kind of a situation which is going to be intriguing to see if this game is going to go higher than all the way up at the 173 level. I'd be inclined to go a little bit lower on that one. With North Carolina, what I'm thinking they're going to be looking at here, and one of the biggest advantages they have is that North Carolina is 9th in the country in free throw attempt rate. Alabama gives up a lot of fouls, gives up a lot of chances at the foul line. I think this is a place where this is going to be where Alabama could be very susceptible. Not only is North Carolina 9th in the country in free throw attempt rate, they're 47th in free throw percentage during real time minutes. When I say that, I just eliminate the garbage time minutes. So they're 47th in the country there. They can do their damage against Alabama. Alabama cannot afford to fall into foul trouble here against North Carolina. That being said, this is a game that scares me a little bit. I'll be honest with you. I thought Alabama would have choked by now. Now, granted, they did get a favorable draw. I talked about a couple weeks ago saying Alabama, I'm dying to pick against this team because they have the first and second round fingerprint of an early loss. But they were fed Alabama light in the first round, and then they got a gift by not having to play St. Mary's in the second round. So now you're going to be playing a team that is going to be really solid on both ends of the ball, who actually likes playing at a pace similar to Alabama's. I can see it being a shootout. But at this point, I still think that North Carolina's defense makes all the difference here. North Carolina's defense is 10th in the country. Alabama's 71st. So this is another going to be, you're waiting for this to happen. I've said before with the Illinois point that if anything was going to break for Alabama, it would have broken by now. Little bit different situation because they've only had to play Charleston and Grand Canyon. I don't think they've been tested yet. I don't think they've truly had an opportunity to be exposed yet, although Grand Canyon kind of got there a little bit, kind of put a little scare in them. But I think North Carolina is too powerful for them here. And I never had great expectations for Alabama's long-term prospects. I think North Carolina wins here and North Carolina covers here.
Kind of countering a little bit, and obviously your analytics are justified, but looking at some regression, speaking of variance and negative variance, some potential negative regression elements, factors for UNC's defense, even though they've improved a lot, I will say, on ball over the last couple of weeks and off ball. But they still rank number 293 when it comes to open 3-point attempt rate allowed. So if Alabama's hitting threes, it's Jekyll and Hyde. They didn't hit threes against Grand Canyon. They covered and they won straight up, but that was more of a product of Grand Canyon missing a bunch of threes and struggling from the free throw line. Also, UNC, if you look at Alabama and trying to attack this UNC defense, Latrell Wrightsell could be playing. Oates kind of hinted at him being back after dealing with yet another concussion against Grand Canyon. We'll see if that comes to fruition. But if he's in, that's a big defensive commodity and one of their best, if not their best, 3-point shooters. Then you look at Alabama when it comes to points allowed in the paint defensively, which is where I think everything kind of comes to a halt here with the Tide, even though my numbers may say otherwise. They rank in the 26th percentile of percentage of points allowed in the paint. That's Armando Bacot and then some down low, even Washington, and in the mid-range too. Alabama ranks in the 6th percentile of mid-range efficiency allowed. So they really struggle to defend those ball screen sets where the guard pulls up. RJ Davis, Harrison Ingram, even Baycott to an extent, but more so Cormac Ryan, can all expose Alabama's defense. So I don't feel as confident as UConn, obviously, Illinois, and even Clemson, just because of my numbers here. But the advantages do side with UNC, and I'm aligned with you there. I'm just worried about a high variance, big time 3-point shooting performance here from Mark Sears in the Alabama offense. And if that does happen, the upset is definitely in the cards, and our numbers kind of show that.
Yeah, definitely. You don't know what to get, what you're going to expect from Alabama from one night to the next. You get their number 302 in consistency. And, you talked about the inside game. I think that is a little bit problematic for defensively for Alabama. They're number 123 in the country for defensive near proximity attempt rate, number 129 defensive near proximity field goal percentage. They give up their chances, the second chances. That's something where North Carolina can really capitalize potential points off second chances. 81st, 27th in second chance conversion percentage. North Carolina will get their opportunities on the front lines. And if they're getting fouled on top of that, like I said, all that free throw attempt rate, a lot of those kind of tie into each other. Sometimes you get that higher free throw attempt rate when you get guys on the inside who are able to get those second chances. That's going to be problematic. You get Alabama in foul trouble, you lose some guys, and all of a sudden it becomes a very similar situation to what you see with teams who play Zach Edey on the inside. All of a sudden you're scrambling for big guys defensively, and how deep can you really go with Alabama on the front lines? That's going to be a big question mark for me.
Yeah, and when you speak to offensive rebounds, UNC elite in that regard because of Baycott. But Alabama, 20 offensive boards against Grand Canyon, but that you wouldn't expect that to come to fruition again against UNC, top 10 defensive rebounding rate. So if you're off from three, kind of conversely to my point of a high variance team in the Tide, if you're off from three, very unlikely that you generate that many offensive rebounds in the third game of the NCAA tournament for the Crimson Tide. But let's move on to the South region, Eric. Starting off with second-seeded Marquette, about a 6.5-point favorite against 11th-seeded NC State, total of 150.5. I've been going back and forth about this game just because, at least in regards to the spread, my raw numbers make it around Marquette minus 4.5, minus 5. And we go back to Marquette, Colorado. We were talking about this mostly off air, and you touched on this at the top. Colorado, if they hit one of their two wide open threes down the stretch, Buffalo's probably advance. And if they hit their threes in the first half, they probably advance to the Sweet 16. Granted, NC State holding off Oakland on Saturday. Oakland could have put the game away in the final seconds with a couple possessions, but Wolfpack winning the game in overtime. The one thing I like with NC State offensively in this matchup, among a couple things, but the big thing for me is I think NC State will be able to handle the post traps that Marquette throws at them in order to generate some of those Shaka Havoc turnovers better than Colorado. If you go back to the Buffs matchup in the round of 32 against Marquette, Eddie Lampkin with 4 turnovers, DJ Burns, as big as he is and as much as we wanted to see Burns against Lampkin, Burns against Iguodaro and those traps down low, really good passing big man. And if Shaka Smart's going to do the same thing, I think Burns has success. Then you think about NC State's ball handlers. Between Morcell, Horn, and O'Connell, and even Burns, they could all handle that Shaka Smart havoc. Marquette ranks in the 19th percentile when it comes to field goal percentage allowed in the paint this season. So if Burns isn't turning the ball over, and if NC State is effectively attacking the paint, either in the mid-range or at the rim, they should have success. So with all those factors in mind, when you think about NC State having a little bit of an advantage offensively and maybe being able to keep pace with Marquette, handle the ball pressure, all those variables do play towards NC State. But what I am worried about is regression here for NC State. Over the last couple months, the Wolfpack are shooting 36.7% from behind the arc. If you go back to over the first 3 months of the season, Wolfpack shot 33.3% from deep. So if they don't hit their threes, could this be a blowout? My numbers say yes, even though they're slightly different from the point spread. That scares me off enough of NC State to, I think this number is right, kind of like my point about UNC and Alabama, but I do think Marquette advances.
Yeah, for me, I have Marquette by about 6 in this game. The over-under is going to be at about 149, it looks like. The one thing for me, and I've always had two concerns about Marquette. One of them is going to be the inside game. It's kind of the question I've always had for the last couple of years. It's always an issue under the Shaka Smart teams of you got guys on the inside who can actually get second chances for your team. That's not exactly a place that really Marquette does not excel. They're 324th in potential points off second chances, 239th in second chance conversion percentage. Now, granted, that doesn't matter a lot of the time. They take a lot of threes. Their adjusted 3-point percentage is 11th in the country, so they're making those threes. So those second chance numbers are naturally going to come down a little bit. So that I understand. That could potentially be a problem when you're looking at a team like NC State. Now, NC State on the inside is not exactly elite. They're good. They're not elite. If you look at their second chance numbers, they're anywhere from 56th to 91st on both ends of the court. I have two metrics on both ends of the court. All four of them, they're between 56th and 91st. So good, but not elite, and that could be problematic. But what I like, what Marquette has going for them, and my big question I had going in the tournament was going to be the health of Tyler Kolek with the oblique injury. And I believe he's probably answered that question if you look at the stats in the first two rounds. He plays 38 minutes against Western Michigan, 18 points, 11 assists, and 6 rebounds. Against Colorado, he plays 40 minutes, 21 points, 11 assists, 5 rebounds. I don't think there's anything wrong with Tyler Kolek. If I had known that Tyler Kolek was going to be 100% healthy, I probably would have had him getting to this point. I think that, again, the hill that Shaka Smart has had to climb has been getting out of those first two rounds. He's finally done that. Now he gets the advantage of playing against the weakest team, arguably, in all the Sweet 16. I think this really sets up really well for Marquette to possibly get to the Final Four. As I talked about, the South is potentially going to be a little bit of a dumpster fire. It has on the bottom half. But if they can come through here and they get the weakest team, that sets them up nicely to play a team like a Duke or a Houston who might beat each other's brains out in this other game. So that is, I would say, a real beacon for success for Marquette to possibly get not only past NC State, but also to the Final Four as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing with NC State. You mentioned Marquette's grind to an extent of the first couple games, and Kolek working his way through that oblique injury or maybe shaking off everybody's negativity with the injury. But NC State playing Oakland and Texas Tech. Texas Tech, a middle-of-the-pack Big 12 team, yes, physical conference, but nonetheless, Oakland from the Horizon League. Pretty well set up and a high-variance team that got just that against Kentucky with one of the most unheralded performances that we typically see in March at times. So you think about the 5 straight wins in 5 days. Yes, one of those was without DJ Horn, but it came against Louisville in the ACC tournament. I think this is where the luck runs out. Now, I'm not saying go to your betting window and back Marquette. My numbers kind of side with NC State covering the point spread. Maybe it's a backdoor. Eric's to a slighter degree, a little bit of a lean towards the Wolfpack. But either way, we both are on or at least leaning towards the notion that Marquette moves on. On to the second of the two South Region matchups, and one of the best matchups in the Sweet 16. 1-seeded Houston, about a 4.5 point favorite. The 4 is juiced to -120, taking on 4-seeded Duke. Total of 134. We haven't touched on totals too much, Eric, so I'm curious what you make of that market, but my raw numbers have this closer to Houston -6. What about you?
So this one's much closer. I have Houston right now looking at this one by about 3.5. The over-under I have on this one is going to be 136 about is what I'm looking at for the over-under on this one. Intriguing matchup between the number 5 offense in the country, Duke, against the number 1 defense in Houston. It's going to be a little bit of a slowdown game. Houston 345th in pace. Duke is probably going to be in no hurry as well. They're 253rd in game pace. This is one of my futures that I was talking about. I've been waiting now for Houston to kind of, I think this is where Houston flamed out last year. If memory serves, this is where Houston got to this point. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, this is when they got bumped out last year. Really playing with fire. I had them losing at this point. I had Texas A&M winning this game against Houston. And unfortunately I kind of gave up on them. And all of a sudden they got right down to the end. And I was like, they're actually going to pull this off and just credit to Houston, considering they had 3 guys following out. I think ended up being 4 when Shed went. that they were actually able to overcome that. Granted, they had shed for most of that second overtime, but just incredible effort by them to overcome what Texas A&M was able to do in regulation and draw even. But in this situation, I'm still leading toward Duke in this one. I have a future on Duke, and I will let that say that probably impacts my decision making a little bit, but I do believe that offense wins championships more than defense. I really like the ceiling of what Duke has to offer. I think that we were a consensus number one coming into the season for a lot of different people, more the eye test people than the analytics people. But I kind of lean towards that when the tournament comes around. As we've talked before, there's during the season, you see teams with high ceilings that don't reach those ceilings. But when they get to the under the lights of March Madness, they seem to find a different gear. And I think that Duke may very well hit that gear here against Houston. So I'm going to probably pick Duke to cover in this one.
You go back to the A&M Houston game. Maybe A&M deserved to win, although that was a double-digit game for the latter part of the second half, most of it. But A&M actually the first team since 1964 to shoot 45 free throws and lose. So if they shoot any better from the line, but they're also not a good free throw shooting team. So maybe take that point with a grain of salt. Duke beating Vermont and James Madison over the first couple rounds. The Dukes knocking off the aforementioned Wisconsin Badgers. I will never forgive Greg Gard and Whiskey for losing that game, and I will very likely never root for Wisconsin ever again. I'm sorry to say, Eric. But you mentioned Duke's efficiency when they're on. Miami against Houston last year. If Duke gets the Jaron McCain like we saw against James Madison, I'm not saying he has to shoot 8 of 11 from 3, but 40%-ish. Proctor, Filipowski, if Filipowski is spacing out Roberts, then maybe you have a chance. And Duke also has the guards to negate Houston's ball pressure to an extent. Maybe Juwan Roberts' shin is bothering him a little bit more than it was in the second half against Texas A&M. But I go back to Duke against Tennessee last year in the round of 32. Physicality really bothered the Blue Devils in that game. Even if you want to give credit to Duke's offense and just saying offense wins championships, which is a fair notion depending on the matchup. Duke against Tennessee, they couldn't handle the ball's physical defense. I think the same storyline arises here. And then I know Houston wants to play at a slow tempo, but they do selectively run like we saw against A&M when Sharp hit some big threes in the second part of the second half, which didn't necessarily matter because A&M got to the overtime, but still, big-time shooter in transition. Duke's transition defense, when you look at how it's graded out against better competition, NC State, UNC, Wake Forest, Pitt, Baylor, even early season Arkansas when the expectations were high for the Razorbacks, they struggled. So I know some of the metrics say Duke has a good transition defense. I don't buy it when you face some of these superior teams in general. I think Houston advances here.
Yeah, furthermore, I think the concern that Duke's going to have as well is they only have 2 guys in the team who average more than 4 defensive rebounds a game. This is a Houston team that if the shots aren't falling, they have a means to get those second chances. They're 13th in the country in near proximity field goal percentage, 34th in potential points off of second chances, 37th in second chance conversion percentage. That's going to be an area of focus for Duke if they're going to win this game. They got to clean the defensive glass against Houston. But, that's the great thing about Houston is they can miss those shots. They're 77th in the country in three-point attempt rate, 59th in three-point percentage. Not bad, really good numbers, but they're number 1 in field goal attempt rate. They don't turn the ball over. They get the second chances. That's going to be a problem for Duke. Duke has got to find a way to minimize those chances for Houston.
And you go back to the Tennessee-Duke game when you speak to offensive rebounds. Last year in the round of 32, Volunteers had 12 of them. So it's definitely a concern. I'm with you there. A lot of variables as to why Houston has an edge. But what are you picking here, and what do you side with against the number?
I'm still picking Duke on this one. I think that Duke has this. I'm picking offense over defense. I'm thinking that defense, eventually those defensive teams, in my opinion, they get to the point where the shots aren't falling. And if an offensive team like Duke, who has the capabilities to actually build a lead pretty quickly, can frustrate Houston, Houston can all of a sudden they find themselves scrambling to catch up, much like they did against Iowa State when they fell behind there. It kind of takes them out of their comfort zone a little bit. I think Duke has the higher ceiling here. I think that was the thing. Like I said, it comes back to the higher ceiling at this point in the year. Houston has a great ceiling, no doubt about it. But I think even with the loss with the injury to Caleb Foster, I think, I still think that Duke has enough here that they can possibly get through to the next round.
Okay. First time we're going Oppo here. I have that slight edge towards Houston against the number, and I do think the Cougars move on. But for your future's sake, since I have no futures on Houston, I hope Duke makes it to the Elite Eight at the least. On to the Midwest region, Eric. One-seeded Purdue and that terrible, terrible player that we touched on earlier, Zach Edey, taking on fifth-seeded Gonzaga. Total of 154.5. This is a rematch of the Maui Invitational matchup where Purdue covered a bit of a similar point spread here and really taking control in the second half of the second half. My raw numbers make this Purdue -5. To me, this boils down to how the officials officiate Zach Edey against Graham Ike. First couple rounds, granted, Purdue dominated the Mountain West team. Mountain West teams have struggled in the NCAA tournament, and they got the best of Grambling State in the second half, okay? How are officials going to call that matchup one way or the other? It's going to be a big factor, and it's truly it brings a lot of variance to the table in its own right. The concern I have with Gonzaga, though, even if fouls maybe are closer to 50-50, does their three-point efficiency continue? I mentioned this with NC State and the high efficiency they've gotten from behind the arc over the last month and a half to 2 months. Gonzaga's beaten McNeese State and a hobbled Kansas team over the first couple of rounds. Over the last month and a half, 2 months, Gonzaga shooting 41.3% since the beginning of February, with Hickman and Gregg leading the way. Does that continue? And if it doesn't, then you look at a guy that may be due for some positive regression in his own right, and Braden Smith. He's shooting just 35% from the field over his first 2 tournament games. And keep in mind, his biggest liability is when opponents press. Gonzaga doesn't press unless you go back to some of those matchups against St. Mary's a year ago. So I favor Purdue, even if the officials kind of lean towards more of a 50-50 split with officiating between Ike and Edey. I think they advance. My numbers are right on the button with Purdue -5. What about you, Eric?
Well, the analytics suggest a closer game, and this is a little bit surprising. I think Gonzaga's been really under the radar for a lot of people analytically. In fact, I have Purdue winning this game by just a little over 3 with an over-under of about 155, 154.5, 155. It really comes down, like you said, there's so much variances involved here in these games with Zach Edey. Is how is that game going to be called, and how many bodies do you have on the inside for Gonzaga? And just looking at what they have, who's going to be able to eat up a lot of the fouls, because he's going to put a lot of these guys in foul trouble on Gonzaga, assuming the referees call the games like they have been playing. So you got Ike at 6'9", 245. He's the natural foil for Edey, but he's going to be probably get his 2 fouls in the first 10 minutes. Who's going to be able to step up to take that role? Anton Watson, 6'8", 225. Braden Huff. Then you got to go down Braden Huff at 6'10", 235. Ben Gregg, 6'10", 225. All of a sudden, how deep can you go and survive while playing that style of basketball? It really depends on how they're going to call this game. Now, Gonzaga has really just blown up. I've talked about that future, that 85-1 future for Gonzaga. But as I mentioned earlier, just something about those top 3 teams, especially UConn and Purdue, seem like teams of destiny right now. So this might be one where I'm kind of inclined to go against the analytics as well as Gonzaga has played. It's just that Purdue just seems like they're just in another level right now. And you saw it against Utah State, where it was just an absolute joke of a game where they just dominated from start to finish in that game. I'm just looking at this right now and saying, what does Gonzaga have? They're number 1 in field goal percentage. They're top 10 everywhere. These are the benefits of going with Gonzaga. They're 10th in adjusted 3-point percentage, 7th from the mid-range, 1st from near proximity percentage, although they don't get made chances up front. That being said, it just feels to me like unless something weird really happens and you're seeing guys like Lawyer and Jones and Smith all of a sudden go ice cold like they did against Fairleigh Dickinson last year, or you get Edey who just somehow falls into foul trouble. It just seems like if everything goes to plan for Purdue, this should be a Purdue cover in my opinion, even if the spread goes higher than the analytics suggest. I have currently 3.5. I think you said you have 5. I would not be surprised at all for Purdue to cover this, given the 5-point spread in this one.
And you go back to the first meeting even, I wanted to gloss over these numbers.
Right.
Purdue only shot 16 free throws in the game. Now, Edey had 10 of those 16, so pretty big percentage of that, but still. Also, three-point shooting. You mentioned Gonzaga's adjusted three-point numbers, but we go back to the first 3 months of the season. They didn't shoot well from three, and this Purdue game was a great example of that. 6 of 32, 18.8%. Nembhard probably shouldn't have taken 9 threes, but Gonzaga may need him to take that many threes, and he's not an efficient three-point shooter in any right. So it's going to boil down to not only how the referees call it, but if Gonzaga's three-point shooting, that efficiency that I mentioned over the last couple months really carries over. Because even if Purdue doesn't get the calls with Edey, if Gonzaga doesn't shoot well, and even if EK is efficient down low, I would expect Smith to play better. I think he has a better matchup here against Nembhard, even though Nembhard could be a little bit testy defensively. Gonzaga doesn't apply much ball pressure. So I really like Purdue to advance, and I'm not a Purdue guy by any means, but I'm with you. We're both on the Boilermakers to at least get to the Elite Eight. Now, the last matchup we're discussing, Matt, is I have a lot of notes, so I want you to go first. The second-seeded Tennessee Volunteers, about a 2.5 3-point favorite against third-seeded Creighton, total of 143.5. My raw numbers have this about Tennessee minus 2.4, minus 2.5, and you go back to the Vols avoiding disaster against Texas when Connect and Ziegler in the round of 32 combined to shoot 2 of 16 from behind the arc. Creighton, as we hit on, probably should have lost to Oregon if Dante wasn't going to the line down the stretch and Shellstad didn't get hurt. And if McDermott finally didn't adjust in the second overtime, because they were getting killed with those ball screen sets with Kuznard and Dante. So where do you see the matchup edge, and who do you like, with both of us potentially leading towards Creighton here just because of our futures?
Yeah, I have Tennessee winning this one by about a little less than 2. The over-under is going to be about 144.5, 145 is what I currently have. Here's my thought about Creighton. And, I liked Creighton going into this. I think the best thing that can happen for a potential national champion, as I have picked Creighton to be my national champion, is to get a scare in the early round. And I talked about, you may have seen me say it on Twitter. I said, I'm terrified that it's going to happen against Akron. I said, I just know it's going to happen against Akron. And it did not happen against Akron, but it did happen against Oregon. And it was a scary situation. Literally that Oregon had 2 guys, maybe 2.5, that were literally just eating them alive in Kuznard and Dante. Shellstad was the third, but he got hurt and he was out near the end. But the fact that they got tested so much and did not play their game, finally showed up in that second overtime, was really a testament to their resilience, to the point where I think, like I said after that game, I'm like, I really would not want to beat Tennessee. I said, because I think Creighton came out of that game. That was kind of the stinker. That was the one that you didn't want to see, and you were hoping you didn't cost them the game. But they came out of that game clean. And I still think that's the better team with a higher ceiling. Now, the analytics don't agree with me. But again, we're looking at offense and defense, and this is where, Tennessee, 25th in the country in offensive efficiency, not necessarily particularly elite. And again, I've seen that again with Tennessee. Granted, they have a lot of firepower there. You can't deny that with Connect and Ziegler and Vescovy. They have to get, but up front, I think this is going to be an easier chance inside for Kalkbrenner, in my opinion. I think Dante was a major problem for him. I think this will not be as big a test. I think this is where you can get Kalkbrenner being a much more of an offensive contributor in this game versus Tennessee. I'm probably going to continue to side with Creighton here, even though the analytics say Tennessee by about 2 in this one. That's what I have it at. But I still think that bad game was kind of the wake-up call for Creighton. I like them against Tennessee in this game. It's going to be the ultimate test between me and my youngest daughter, because I have Creighton going all the way, and my 13-year-old daughter has Tennessee. So I guess we're both watching that game.
So you go back to the Oregon game, and I want to challenge you on one thing, and then I'll share what I have on this one. Creighton, like you said, they got battle tested, right, against Oregon, but they shot 38.5% from 3. On the flip side, Tennessee, similar instance. You get tested against Texas, especially in the second half. Your best player doesn't shoot well, neither does Ziegler, and here you are in the Sweet 16. So among battle-tested teams and teams that are due for more positive regression, wouldn't that be the Vols?
I don't necessarily say that because I think that Texas probably presented more of a challenge to Tennessee. In fact, I had Tennessee losing to Texas.
Wow.
Just thinking that was going to be, I really believed in what they had going for them with Texas, with Dessou and A. Smith and Mitchell. I thought they had a lot of talent there and that could overcome Tennessee if Tennessee had an off game. Now, Tennessee was able to deliver. In my opinion, there's a big difference between, not a big difference, but there's a difference between Texas and Oregon. Texas was a team that was always going to be in the tournament. Oregon was a team that got hot on the shoulders, largely of N'Faly Dante. I think that performance from Creighton was probably a little less expected than the one for Tennessee versus Texas, in my opinion. So, fair point. I'm going to give you that, and that was a close game. You could argue that they were tested as well. They win that game in regulation. So this will be a very interesting contest. I can understand why it's going to be close, and I could definitely see why people will pick Tennessee in this game. But, I've always had this long-term belief that offense is always going to trump defense, and in this situation, I think Creighton's going to do the same for Tennessee.
Well, a couple numbers that would agree with you, at least on my end. Not saying to bet Creighton because of this by any means, but you're going to see it blasted everywhere on every social media account. Rick Barnes 4-16 against the number in the NCAA tournament since 2010. So not covered against Texas. Can you trust Tennessee? Can you trust Barnes in the tournament? And with Creighton, the only reason why I would suggest taking money line, or among others, the biggest reason would be high variance team. If they're going to cover the number, they're likely going to win if they're on from three. To your point, if you're going to trust Creighton's offense to continue shooting well, it's not like they've overshot expectations to the nth degree. They've shot about maybe a little bit above their season average, but nothing crazy. So you could easily see the three-point efficiency continuing. And then with Tennessee outside of threes, they thrive on getting to the line. Creighton allows the lowest free throw attempt in college basketball. They don't foul. So is Tennessee going to be able to get those advantages? And if not, can Creighton control the defensive glass, speed up Tennessee in transition? Maybe. But you go back to the final game against Tennessee in the regular season with Kentucky spacing out Tennessee. Some people may point to that game as a reason why Creighton could do the same thing. Tennessee allowing a top 75 three-point scoring rate in college basketball. But I just wonder how much of that was Kentucky trying to get a top 4 seed in the SEC tournament and Tennessee outside of senior night not really having a ton to play for. Then you think about Stephen Ashworth trying to hang with Sakai Ziegler. That's an athleticism disadvantage for Creighton. Creighton overall athletically had a disadvantage against Tennessee. So I'm kind of split ends here. I have my Creighton future, one of my 2 futures left. I have Clemson Final Four and Creighton to win it all. Creighton was placed preseason, so I don't have nearly as much optimism, by the way, keep that in mind, with Creighton as I did last year. And you go back to, Eric, one last thing that I want to say, which is negating my love for my Creighton futures, or lack thereof, I guess. Creighton's path last year in the tournament, they beat NC State in the first round. They beat Baylor. Keep in mind, not a Baylor defense that, like we saw 3 or 4 years ago in the NCAA tournament. They beat Princeton. Physical Ivy League defense, but not much to write home about at that defensive end when you compare them to high major teams. Then you lose to San Diego State. Tough game, down to the wire, but still, that was their first true physical defense they faced. Tennessee, arguably, I know Oregon, like you said, they peaked down the stretch, but Tennessee, their toughest, most athletic matchup in the tournament so far. That's concerning to me. But hey, if Creighton goes off from 3, and if Connect has another off game, if Tennessee gets spaced out like they did against Kentucky, and if Barnes struggles to call sets down the stretch, Creighton probably wins the game outright. But there are so many variables, man. Kind of to my point with Alabama. If Alabama shoots well, they probably move on, or above 40%. If Creighton shoots well, they probably move on.
Yeah. Tennessee, one key metric on they're third in the country in defensive efficiency, but 287th in defensive three-point attempt rate. So they're going to pack it in. They're 17th defending the three, if you're looking at field goal percentage. But what does that tell you? They will usually allow those threes, but they'll allow those threes under duress. Now, is Creighton going to be able to potentially convert those threes? How are they going to perform off the dribble? That's going to be the question, because they probably may not get often wide open looks, but that's kind of the fingerprint that I get whenever I see that kind of variance. When you look at that big difference between 3-point attempt rate and 3-point percentage, it usually means that a lot of those shots are kind of coming up out of duress, or they force them into situations, advantageous situations defensively that work for Tennessee. The question is Creighton going to fall for that? Now, that's a very talented 3-point shooting team. They live and die by that three. Will Tennessee employ the same strategy against a Creighton team that is as good as they are from 3-point line?
Right. I mean, there are so many factors here, and the key is when you mention off the dribble and maybe not being able to get as many catch and shoot looks, will Creighton get worn down by Tennessee's physicality throughout the game and then start missing some of those off the dribble threes that maybe they would theoretically make on a given night? Like, you look at 3-point efficiency off the dribble, Creighton top 5 in college basketball, which goes without saying just because of how reliant they are on the three. Also 34th in college basketball when it comes to 3-point frequency off the dribble. You go back to those two UConn matchups, man. First time around in stores, home game for UConn, Klingon's first game back, so you factor in some of those situational angles for UConn, but Creighton didn't shoot well, got worn down, got blown out of the gym. Creighton, second time around against UConn. I wouldn't necessarily compare the margin of victory, but more so to just Creighton shot an absurd percentage from three, and they knocked off UConn. So that's kind of going to be the difference here. Does Creighton get blown out, or do they win outright? That's why I say money line or nothing if you like the Jays.
I completely agree with you, and I see that point of view. Like I said, it's really tough to say. So many darn variables here. That's just really going to be tough. Like I said, I get this feeling like that. Good, fair point about Tennessee. They did get challenged as well, but the fact that you really put a scare in Creighton means they're going to bring it now, in my opinion. I think that was the game that I was hoping I was going to see against Akron in round 1 that was going to wake them up, but they got it in the first 2 rounds. I'm not so sure Tennessee got the same kind of scare. Texas is a much better team. I just believe that Creighton is now going to be focused in on this game. I still like the advantages up front better for Creighton in this game. I think that was a big I think Dante created a big problem for Kalkbrenner. A lot of people I talked to me like, where was Kalkbrenner? Kalkbrenner has done nothing. And then all of a sudden he hit a big 3 in overtime. I think he has a much better game here. I just look at this and my gut feeling on this one says the Blue Jays.
I hope you're right. Not any sort of an edge for me. I'll kind of live or die here with my Creighton futures. I'm not going to hedge just because you're a high variance team. You hit a lot of threes. I kind of like the number I got preseason at 40-1. So I'm going to stick with it. Not hedging my Clemson Final Four futures either, for that matter, at this point, despite them being 2 games away. But I'm hoping, since I don't have an edge raw number wise, coin flip-ish in regards to my projection in the point spread, then hopefully Creighton moves on. But recapping here, Eric, teams to move on and maybe market edges towards the point spread. Maybe if you want to throw out a total 2 edges that you like. UConn, San Diego State. We both have UConn advancing. Slight lean towards the under here, numbers-wise for me, but nothing dramatic by any means. UConn, edge-wise, more so towards moving on versus the point spread. I wouldn't advocate to bet San Diego State, but I wouldn't be surprised if they cover. Iowa State, Illinois, we both have Illinois advancing. So we both theoretically like them on the money line. Arizona, Clemson, we both like the Tigers to cover, if not win outright. UNC, Alabama, coin flip game to me in regards to projections and the spread, no market edge. You're going with UNC though, right?
I am barely. It's a game that makes me uncomfortable. Like I said, the only reason I go UNC is, like I said, we're talking about those teams not being tested. Alabama has not truly been tested yet, in my opinion. You can say they were tested by Grand Canyon, but it's Grand Canyon. It's they've had to play Charleston and Grand Canyon. This is North Carolina, different ballgame.
Marquette, NC State, we both like the Golden Eagles to advance. Not a big enough edge for Eric or I to advocate point spread wise to bet the Golden Eagles, though. Backdoor, always in the realm of possibilities. Houston and Duke, this is where we differ. I got the Cougars advancing, market edge for me on the point spread, but you like Duke to advance and then therefore cover, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Higher ceiling than Houston. I think Houston's, this is where the defense gets them. This is where the offensive teams will bite them. And I think Duke advances.
All right. And then Purdue, Gonzaga, edge towards Purdue to advance. You as well, but we're both in line with the current spread. And then Tennessee, Creighton, we're both praying that the Jays advance, right?
Yeah, those last two games, as well as Gonzaga has played, oh my God, like I said, Purdue just feels like they're on a mission. I mean, it's you're waiting, if you're a Purdue fan, it's again, I've joked about Purdue for years. I'm like, you're just waiting for the bad thing to happen. And I my God, Gonzaga has been played so well. And I even joked and said I'm going to spoon with my 85-1 Gonzaga ticket. But still, I mean, it's the worst team they could possibly face in this, in my opinion, right now. Purdue is creates such a problem for them. And then you said Tennessee and Creighton. In my opinion, game of that Thursday, Friday set of games. That is just a peak 4-star matchup in my opinion. I'm looking forward to that one a lot. Siding with Creighton in that one, but anything can happen in that game. Tennessee is a very, very quality team as well.
As Ian Eagle would say, anything can happen March. But what we do want to say is, some analysts may say these are risk-free investments. We're not going to go that far. So keep in mind, we have our edges. We have teams that we like to advance, but by no means put your mortgage on this thing on any game. And people can't get in trouble when it comes to March Madness betting. So we just want to advocate responsible betting, not risk-free investments. But if you're looking to bet, fade, or tail with us here on Outside Shots, and you're not a user over at BetMGM Sportsbook already, you can bet $5, get $150 in bonus bets with promo code The Lines One Word. You can also watch or listen. If you are watching or listening to the show in North Carolina, be sure to check out all the sports betting promos with the Tar Heel State legalizing sports betting just a couple weeks ago at thelines.com. You can find our official bets in the Discord channel. Link is over at thelines.com. In the top right-hand corner, for Eric, I'm Eli Herskovich. You can follow Eric on X at Haslametrics. You can follow me at Eli Herskovich. Thanks for watching and listening to another edition of Outside Shots. So long, everybody, and good luck with your Sweet 16 bets.